Welcome to UK Politics review session. We're going to start with chapter 1, which is about democracy and participation. And we're going to start with the two forms of democracy that are practiced. The first is direct democracy, in which individuals express their opinions themselves. The second form of democracy is representative democracy. This is where people elect representatives to serve in the government at different levels who take decisions on the behalf of their constituents or voters. Now we're going to go into these in more detail. What you do need to know is that direct democracy is rarely actually practiced. It originated in ancient Athens because the adult males all had a part in the decision making at public meetings. But most modern countries are simply too large for direct democracy to take place in a general fashion. Nothing would get done. There are certain limited areas where we do have where we do practice direct democracy, but for the most part, most quote-unquote democracies around the world practice representative democracy. Now I'll start with representative democracy. In that form of democracy, representatives are not delegates. They aren't expected to do everything that their voters want them to do. They are expected to use their own personal judgment, but they are held accountable to their voters via elections, which happen on a regular basis. In America, that's every 4 years. Here in the UK, it has varied. I believe we have in place a law that says it should happen at least every 5 years. Both direct democracy and representative democracy are based on the concept of majority rule. And yet in the representative system, there are many more safeguards to protect minorities. So in the UK, voters elect politicians to make decisions on their behalf. Again, this is one of the reasons why there is no direct democracy. If you expected the public to have the time or the time to vote or the time to simply get educated on the issues to understand how to vote for them, this would be inconceivable. So therefore, we have professional politicians whose job it is to acquire this sort of political understanding so that they can make informed decisions in the interests of the whole nation. They are held accountable to their electorate by regular elections, and this allows voters to retain what is known as sovereignty, or the ultimate power, because the voters decide whether or not to renew what is known as the mandate of their representatives. Representative democracy is also based on the principle that elected politicians should represent the interests of all of their constituents. So one of the jobs of members of parliament, for example, is to go back and forth between their constituencies and Westminster so that they can listen to concerns of their constituents in public meetings. That will allow them to get educated on what they need to do to better the lives of their constituents. Citizens elect their representatives on their behalf. All adult citizens have the right to vote for representatives. These elections are expected to be free and fair, and citizens delegate their authority to the representatives by means of the elections. Now, the representatives can't just act according to their constituents' wishes. They weigh up the feelings of the people they represent with their party's manifesto and their wider understanding of whatever the issue is. The representatives need to act in according to their best judgment rather than just follow the voters' wishes. Westminster Parliament has 650 members of Parliament at this time, and because of recent events, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland also have devolved governments with a limited mandate for what they can do independent of Westminster. We also have elected mayors and local councils that provide an additional layer of representation. So the next thing that we want to look at is the advantages of a representative democracy. The main advantage is that the government is carried out by these professional politicians, and that they have the time and the energy to become well informed about political issues. They're more likely to make politically educated decisions than most members of the public, who can be swayed by emotion and may not fully understand the complexities of any one question. Parliamentary bills are drawn up by ministers and civil servants. They're debated in both houses of the UK, and then they're analyzed at a committee stage when amendments may be added. Also, elected politicians balance conflicting interests when reaching decisions. This protects the rights of all citizens, especially minorities. It ensures that the implications of a decision for all the members of a community have been thoroughly examined. So if you're a minority member of the UK, you're less likely to be lost in the shuffle with a representative democracy. In a direct democracy, for example, the public vote would be according to everybody's individual self-interest, and you wouldn't need to consider the effect of your decisions on anybody else, so therefore the interests of the minority might be neglected. Representative democracy also comprises the principle of accountability, which means that in those regular elections, voters can decide whether or not to renew the mandate of their representatives. If the public doesn't approve the policies of a government, they have the opportunity to elect a new one, and pressure them to resign, as in the case of Liz Truss, to a representative democracy. For example, critics of the representative democracy argue that MPs are often disengaged from the public and so don't adequately represent the interests of the public. They point to the presence of powerful pressure groups and lobbyists and the London-based media, the paparazzi, and claim that there's, quote-unquote, a Westminster bubble that disconnects voters from their representatives. Also, MPs can have outside interests, which may provide a conflict of interest and compromise their ability to fully represent their constituents. In the UK in particular, there is a lot of grumbling sometimes about the method of election, which is called first past the post. And what that means is that mostly Conservatives and Labour are the two parties that dominate the House of Commons. And minority parties such as UKIP and Greens may struggle to gain appropriate representation even when they've polled highly in the popular vote. So that form of representative elections sometimes can be seen as a disadvantage. Also, because we're looking at professional politicians, the social makeup of Parliament is primarily white, male, and middle class. It caused quite a bit of controversy when Liz Truss announced her cabinet because so many of the people on her cabinet were not white and male and middle class. And that was a first, and unfortunately it didn't last very long. The other disadvantages are that it might reduce participation in the electoral process because people have chosen to hand responsibility to the politicians. People can just choose not to vote, thinking that their vote doesn't count. Politicians are very skilled because they're professional. They're skilled at avoiding accountability, especially because general elections are 5 years apart. And they might be corrupt or incompetent. They might betray electoral promises and put the loyalty of the party before their responsibility to their electorate. So these are some of the disadvantages of a representative democracy. For direct democracy, decisions are made directly by the public. There's no channeling of opinions through their representatives, and there's no distinction between government and citizen. There's just a continuous engagement by the public in the democratic process. Now, like I said before, this is impossible in a large modern state because there's simply too many people. But as I said also, there are some elements of direct democracy that do happen. The most important one that we are familiar with is the national referendum. Examples of this were the 1975 and 2016 EU votes. There was one for coming into the EU and the other for leaving. There also was a referendum in 2011 on whether to change the system of voting for the Westminster Parliament. That ultimately did not lead anywhere. But they were national referendums, and with a national referendum, everybody's vote counts. Another way that we have direct democracy, or some form of it, is the 2015 Recall the MPs Act. This allows a petition to be triggered if a member of parliament is imprisoned or suspended from the House of Commons. If 10% of the constituency then signs the petition, they can force what is known as a by-election, an election that doesn't fall within the 5 years and which will allow the MP to possibly be replaced or re-elected, and that is more closely related to a form of direct democracy. Some of the advantages of direct democracy is that it allows equal weight to all votes, because in a representative system, the varying sizes of constituents mean that not all votes have equal value. It also encourages popular participation in politics because it expects people to take their duties as citizens seriously. It also removes the need for representatives because people can take responsibility for their own decisions, and it develops a sense of community and encourages genuine debate. However, disadvantages are that, like I said, it's impractical in a large, heavily populated modern state. Many people will not want to, or feel qualified to take part in decision making. It's also open to manipulation by the most articulate speakers. Think about Hitler, who was able to sway many, many people with his speeches, because articulate speakers can sway people to their decisions or their viewpoints and possibly take advantage of direct democracy to get their will done. And the will of majority is not mediated by parliamentary institutions, and so therefore the needs or viewpoints of minorities are often disregarded. So this ends the advantages and disadvantages, and the next section that we're going to look at is the need for reform of the parliamentary process, the representative democracy in the UK. It's an ongoing debate. People look at the UK and try to determine how well the democratic system is actually functioning, and is there any possibility for it to be improved upon. This is in part because the government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the people. So, for example, if voting patterns are to have less and less people vote, ultimately a minority is electing the government that then makes decisions for the majority, and that calls into question whether that government is legitimate. So we need to look at what's going on and whether it should be improved. Right now, critics suggest that there's so much political disengagement that we need to take radical steps to re-inspire enthusiasm for the democratic process. People of your generation are less likely to vote than your parents. And that's a concern, because if you take that into the rest of your life and you never vote, and if the generation after you doesn't vote, and so on and so forth, then who's going to actually do the voting for any government officials? Also, trust in politicians has declined because of various controversies and rumors and sleaze that is reported. You look at Boris Johnson and some of the things that he was involved in, and his track record for inspiring trust and confidence is not always there. So that means that people are just not going to trust the government anyway, and might pull away from the democratic process as a result. So there are some positive democratic features. One of these is the devolved governments for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, as well as the elected mayors for London and other cities. This means that more decisions are taken closer to the local people. The second positive feature is an independent judiciary. This means that the judiciary is not influenced by either the Queen or King or Parliament. It can rule to uphold or strike down the rule of various laws or acts, and therefore it protects a wide range of personal freedoms. There's also the fair and free elections that are held in the UK. Unlike the US, recent events, the actual election process is fairly free of corruption and intimidation. And as well, we do have the supplementation of elections through the opportunities to vote in referendums. So the actual process seems to be holding up pretty well. There's also a free media. We have freedom of the press. This allows people to independently challenge government policy and expose the misdeeds of politicians should they actually exist. All you gotta do is pick up a newspaper and see all the criticality towards the government. As much as that might be depressing to look at, it is still an important factor in democracy because it means that we're not having a censored press. And so we know we can find out, or the pursuit of truth is welcomed. And finally, we have this large range of political parties and pressure groups. So there is a lot of things that people can belong to if they want to engage in democracy. However, we would be lying to say that there aren't some problems. One of them is the underrepresentation of minority viewpoints. The House of Commons, as I said before, is elected by the first-past-the-post system, and that means that there's often what's considered a mismatch between the votes cast for political parties and the seats each party wins in Parliament. When we go through the electoral processes, that will become a little more clear. But it means that in a constituency, one party might get the popular vote, but another party might actually win the seat. And that overall, if you look at the country overall, the percentage of popular vote that a party gets may not reflect the number of seats that they have in Parliament, because it depends on where the pockets of voters are in terms of who wins each constituency. In addition, so that's one problem. In addition, we have a House of Lords, and that House of Lords lacks democratic legitimacy. All the members of the House of Lords are unelected. Now, there have been periodic attempts to reform this. All of them have failed. The people in the House of Lords are appointed by prime ministers and other party leaders. They are considered experts in their profession and field, and they're present in the upper house, but they are not there by being elected. Now, when we talked about UK government, we talk a little bit about what is going on in the House of Lords and why that works, where it came from. Ultimately, it's a holdover of just the historic process of the development of Parliament and the fact that there was never a point in time where somebody decided, no, this is how the government should run. So the House of Lords is inherited from medieval times when the primary people around the king and the primary advisors were all the upper classes and nobility and bishops. And so the House of Commons got added later, and it's through the ebb and flow of history that power shifted from House of Lords to House of Commons. But because of that, we have a holdover, which is a House of Lords that's not elected. So the third problem that some people see in the UK democracy is that we don't have a constitution and we don't have a Bill of Rights, or one specific Bill of Rights. So some people see that the citizens' rights have a certain amount or a certain lack of protection. Now, that doesn't mean we have nothing. The European Convention on Human Rights was incorporated into UK law in 1998. This is known as the Human Rights Act, and it provides guarantees for the rights of citizens in the relationship for the state. Now, obviously, there's always going to be certain situations where the government can suspend these articles of this act. Most of those would be emergency situations, such as when we went through COVID. The government had the power to restrict us to our houses and arrest us if we left for unlawful reasons, such as, going to the doctor, going to the grocery store, going to exercise, and going to the pharmacy. Those were the 4 reasons that we were allowed to leave our house when it first came here. But the way that Parliament runs, that act, the Human Rights Act of 1998, can be revoked. And then what do we do with our rights and how are they protected? And then lastly, one of the problems that we see is that our media is largely controlled by wealthy business interests that are not held to account by anybody. So you think about the Murdoch Group, which owns the Times, the Sunday Times, and the Sun. Whatever Rupert Murdoch wants to see published is likely to get published in those 3 newspapers, and that can cause some potential problems. So before I go into more about this participation crisis and some problems in the UK democracy, I did want to go through some additional types of direct democracy. I've already mentioned referendums, and in referendums, whichever side gains over 50% of the vote wins outright. And obviously the Scottish independence referendum, EU membership referendum of 2016, these are examples of it. Electronic petitions are another one. If a petition on a government website reaches 100,000 signatures, it will be considered for debate in the House of Commons. Doesn't mean that there's any legislation, just means that there'll be a debate. One example of this was meningitis B vaccination being made available to all children. And then the second time we had a referendum about whether the UK should leave the EU, that was the referendum never happened, but it was a subject of debate because I think they got something like 3 million signatures of people who are like, please, have a second referendum. It was rejected in Parliament. Another form of direct democracy are what are known as consultative exercises. This is when government bodies may want to assess the likely reaction to their proposed policies. An example of this is communities which may be affected were consulted over the expansion of Heathrow and as well the HS2 rail link. So those things allow people to directly express their opinion and possibly have an effect on the decisions. Another form of direct democracy in the UK are what is known as open primaries. Now, these don't happen in all the constituencies. It's a very small number that have them. And this allows the constituencies to select parliamentary candidates through open primaries, in which the public directly decides who the candidate should be. This happened in Totnes in 2009. The independent MP Sarah Wollaston became the Conservative candidate for Totnes. She won the open primary. So another one is the election of the leadership of political parties. So within a political party, main leaders are decided by simple direct democracy, but only within the party. So when Liz Truss was elected the leader of the Conservative Party when Boris Johnson stepped down, that would have been done by all of the Conservative members of the party voting for who they wanted, and Liz Truss wound up winning that. So all main political parties now allow their membership to decide whom the leader of their party will be. And as we said, this might be significant if it means that that's who the prime minister is. And another example of this is in 2015, Jeremy Corbyn was elected the leader of the Labour Party with 59.5% of the vote of the member parties. He was re-elected in 2016 with 61.8% of the party members voting for him. And then I mentioned the recall of the MPs Act in 2015. So those are all ways that direct democracy does still happen. But let's return to the problems that people see in the way representative democracy functions in the UK. And one of this is a quote-unquote participation crisis. And so it's widely held belief by critics that the democratic system in the UK is suffering because there's just a lack of engagement in the political system amongst a significant section of the population. So how do we measure participation? One of the most easy ways is by looking at the turnout for general elections. And the average turnout has dropped significantly. In 1964, that turnout was 77.1. 1966, it was 75.8. 1970, it was 72. It went up in 1974, but then started dropping again in 1983. It was back down to 72.7. It hangs around the mid-70s, but in 2001, it's down to 59.4%. In 2005, it's only at 61.3. 2010, 65.2. 2015, 66.1. So it's dropped 10% since the 1960s and 70s. This is often looked at as a problem. But there are some general elections that have inspired very high levels of turnout. One of those was in 1964 because Harold Wilson was running a very dynamic campaign aiming at ending, quote-unquote, 13 wasted years of conservative rule. 1974, there was a campaign of Who Governs Britain, and it was a general election called by Edward Heath. 1979, Margaret Thatcher's first election against James Callaghan in the wake of the quote-unquote winter of discontent, what inspired a high level of turnout. And then 1992, John Major against Neil Kinnock. And so there are some points where there's spikes in the participation, but it has decreased ever since around 2000, 2001. And when one compares 1983 to 2017, in each case, radical socialist alternatives were being offered to a conservative government, but in each of those years, voting declined by 4%. So the question is, are we really in a participation crisis? One of the things that people who like the UK system, one of the things they point out is that for the UK, the turnout is still a lot higher than the US. And so they think because the US is probably the most famous form of representative democracy, they say, okay, if we're doing better than the US, we're doing pretty well. But compared to other European democracies where voting is not compulsory, we are actually significantly lower. In 2017, the Dutch election had a turnout of 81.9%, and Germany and France both have much higher turnouts than the UK does. Spain is around the same amount as the UK, and the US is 10 percentage points smaller. Another way that we see turnout being smaller as an indication of participation crisis is this idea of membership of political parties, because this also is significantly lower these days than it was in the 1950s. In 2016, the Conservative Party had just under 150,000 members. And this is a considerable drop from even 20 years before then in the 1990s when they had 400,000. So down to 150,000 from 400,000. Labor, theirs increased to 1997, but then fell while the party was in government. So now, so it was about 190,000. And it's under Jeremy Corbyn that this is raised again, so that it's now 515,000 by 2016. But you notice that Labour is not in charge of the government. It's still a Conservative Party dominating the government. And fluctuations have existed in the Liberal Democrats, which is mostly seen as the third biggest party. So this has been a situation that might be seen as indicating a participation crisis, but this doesn't necessarily mean that, because it just means voters might be increasingly unlikely to fully identify with one of the parties. And so it doesn't mean that they won't participate in voting. It's just that they might pick and choose according to each individual candidate rather than wanting to be associated with a party and the general manifesto of that party. In addition, we see an increase in the membership of smaller parties. In 2015, the general election recorded that 29.4% of the vote actually went to parties other than the Conservatives, Labour, and Liberal Democrats. We see an increase in the membership dramatically in the Scottish National Party, for example. In 2013, they had 25,000, but in 2016, barely 3 years later, not even 3 years later, they had 120,000. The Green Party has gone from 13,800 in the same amount of space to 55,000, and the UKIP or UKIP has gone, this is much more modest, from 32,400 to 39,000. So this is one of those situations where it's like, what do the voting trends actually show? So the question that we do have to ask is there a crisis of participation? So there are other less formal ways for people to get involved in politics. One of those is to become part of a pressure group. Pressure groups are more singularly focused. They tend to deal with specific issues such as the environment, and membership of these groups has been increasing, and we've seen numerous well-attended demonstrations on issues such as fuel prices, the Iraq War, fox hunting, and student tuition fees. And it's become popular or accepted that there will be direct action as a part of modern politics. So what we might be seeing is just a shift in how people are expressing how they feel. And so there are successes for websites such as 38 Degrees that also demonstrate that with the advent of social media and the advent of the internet, that people just may be forming different ways of expressing their opinion, particularly the young people, because with the emergence of social media, what that's enabled people, especially the young, is to exchange political views and participate in online campaigns on particular issues. In some ways, they get to do this without engaging in the real world. So again, one of the examples of this would be e-petitions. In 2007, there was one that was signed by 1.8 million people. This was against proposals for road charging. So is it a participation crisis if people are uninvolved in traditional politics but have other ways of being engaged? There does seem to be a political apathy, a lack of an interest or awareness on contemporary events. and political issues that affect society. Um, People are, but that might be because people are generally contented with their lives. It'll be interesting to see the next general election, because right now, with the cost of living crisis and whatnot, people might be, that happiness might be actually being affected. So there are then different ways that people suggest um, how we could reform the British system of government. One of the things that's probably not helping is just the exposure of different corruptions and so on and so forth. For example, in 2009, the Daily Telegram published evidence of a widespread abuse of the system, allowing MPs to claim expenses for living costs. It led to a number of apologies, and 5 former MPs and 2 members of the House of Lords were sentenced to prison terms. So this has been, people have gone after reforming it, but it doesn't mean that people's opinions have changed regarding it. And what that means is that, similar to lawyers in general, politicians are one of the least trusted professions by the public. And so that by itself is a bit of a concern, but also in some ways something to take amusement by.